one can look at the vulnerability in a sort of almost micro level. And this was based on the loads that are being pushed on a piece of infrastructure and the capacity for that infrastructure to withstand it. Those loads may change over time, and those changes may be in part climate-driven. In part, there may be other reasons for it. And in a cumulative way, you can take that into account. Similarly, the capacity can also change over time for climate reasons and for other reasons that have a similar outcome. But that relationship between loads and capacities, now, middle, and at the end of the life cycle, can provide an indication of whether climate change presents a potentially unacceptable vulnerability to the infrastructure of interest. Similarly, for adaptive capacity, if one goes back and thinks of what is the performance goal that one is looking at in the relationship, was it for the Finch Road to stay structurally sound, or was it for the local road to not have water overtopping it? Those are two different performance goals. What is the maximum load before that performance goal is reached? And those would be two different answers for two different types of performance goals. But if you look at the variety of ways in which you judge success or failure in your infrastructure, then you will have a variety of potential answers on where climate change adaptation is not a problem, might be a problem, already is a problem. So I think in going through this, and as we talk about constraints with respect to information, one will come out with experience in using both numerical values but also relative values. You may not know what x is, but if you know x is greater than y, and x is increasing, it'll still be greater than y. In terms of recommendations that come out, I think most people in the room have had experience with risk management decision making. So more information could be an outcome, or more information requirement could be an outcome, or how it is gathered, perhaps improving the quality of the information being gathered. Management actions, monitoring, operations, and maintenance would be examples. New initiatives or corrective action may be the outcome. And like I said before, it could be that no further action is an outcome. One of the NRCan-funded efforts in the last few years at developing climate change, infrastructure vulnerability decision-making tool has been through an entity called the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee, PIVC. And they have a website, pivc.ca, that people can get extra information on if you're not already familiar with it. But essentially, this group had developed for it a protocol for doing evaluations and then test drove it on a series of case studies in the past year or so. Originally with PIVC, there was a vision of a broad national evaluation of many classes of public infrastructure. The case study experiences of this past year perhaps have shown a reality that infrastructure decision-making is much more site-specific than perhaps some of the folks in Ottawa first imagined it might be. And also the text associated with the case studies could probably be simplified if it were being used in a more general application in the future. Okay. In terms of practical considerations, and we can talk about these more during our other breaks, this is a new topic. It does not yet have much of a broad-based standard or off-the-shelf approach, although I suspect Eric will be making an effort to change that in the near future. However, some useful examples do exist. Mandates, in particular mandates for like a municipal government or a provincial government, generally do not exist for managers and practitioners to execute. One thing that I was pleasantly surprised at breakfast this morning was hearing that actually in the Vancouver area, a mandate had been given to the decision makers to try and take climate change into account. I'm not quite sure how the ins and outs were, but I thought that was useful. And where this comment comes from was it wasn't that long ago where the Federation of Canadian Municipalities spearheaded an effort called InfraGuide. And InfraGuide tried to establish best practices for a variety of different things related to infrastructure. But one of the aspects of that program that I thought was particularly interesting is they methodically went out and had a whole range of municipal governments across Canada pass as a resolution, yes, we want our engineers and planners to take InfraGuide into account. Well, if something like that could be done again for climate change adaptation, you now have that mandate from the top. You have that mandate to the engineers and planners and others in the middle of the structure that says, okay, that's part of the 5 things now instead of 4 things I want to take into account. I will methodically try and do that to the best of my abilities. But without that being there, many folks will continue to say, well, these are the only 4 things I'm focused on. And if it's not there, I'm not going to work through it. Also, there is the availability and the cost to consider of better information to further reduce risks. Perhaps it's not quite in somebody's back pocket to have an extra 6 months or $50,000 to do another run of something, in which case other alternatives may have to be made. There are some practical opportunities out there for the decision makers. You can make, I believe, a much more effective use of limited resources, be it human, equipment, financial, natural opportunity, time, or otherwise, in going this route compared to other options. There is the opportunity for risk reduction to take place over the total life cycle asset costs for both public and private sector infrastructure. And also there's the opportunity for broad-based project teams to organically or magically form in response to available budgets. So if there's a mandate to try and do things and there's a project budget put out there, there may be teams that people never thought of will come together in response to that in a project format and try and give a good crack at the best information at the best times. Motivations for decision makers who seek to improve the quality of their long-term decision making, although perhaps for some, a 4-year cycle is their long-term decision making. And respond to the interests of their constituents. Their constituents may be voters, if it's at a municipal council level. The constituents may well be shareholders in a company that's seeking the long-term protection of the capital that they've invested in. Seek the most effective use of limited resources, and also seek adjusted values for use in climate-sensitive decision-making. Some constraints, and with people from Environment Canada and Ornos here, we can talk more about this afterwards. Incorporating climate change into infrastructure decision-making is typically most cost-effective when it's used at the design stage of the asset life cycle. Less so during construction. Hurts like anything to, say, make changes to the building we're in once it's already constructed. But if you can catch these things at the design stage or at the replacement of infrastructure, and I think many of us in the room are familiar that Canada has a huge infrastructure deficit, and it's not unreasonable to think that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, or until we're all retired, there will be hopefully more infrastructure money being spent. And that could be an opportunity to account or roll in climate change adaptation as part of the mandate of those things. If it's at a federal level, then perhaps that's one of those little line items in federal money that comes forward. Do it this way, but also take this into account. That can be an effective way going forward. In terms of legal and regulatory structures, I suggest we could turn the question around. What structures apply to current climate and weather-influenced decision-making? And where those already apply are perhaps the places where climate change might be taken into account. But in general, it's probably too early for there to be a top-down regulation by decision makers of the activities of others that thou shalt take climate change into account now, because of all the uncertainties involved with it. It's probably much better in the long run for encouraging that type of decision making to happen from the bottom up through the voluntary evaluations and applications, and let that voluntary effort organically pick off what is probably the most significant places where climate and weather sensitive information or infrastructure decision making will take place. So there is some useful information out there. Other people in the room have some of that, and we can keep looking. NRCan has provided a tremendous amount of support to different folks over the years, and their new effort at regional adaptation collaboratives, which will be happening more in 2009, will help with that. PyBC.ca is a potential source of information as are the planners. The ACT group, based in Simon Fraser, will be useful in the long run. Toronto, love it or hate it, but Toronto is city government, will be a useful source of information as well, and there's others. Outside of Canada, many of the usual suspects, UK SIP, the Americans, European Union, the UN, and institutions such as the World Bank, or, now that I've seen the sponsors, Zurich, and also with respect to the climate information of one's using. Environment Canada can be a source of information, although there tends to be a hesitancy about, yes, here is the scenario we would recommend for this particular location, but at a more general level, it can be very useful. Uranos will, for a price, put a professional opinion on the table. We recommend this number in this area. And there will be other people out there. And on the private sector side, if you're trying to pick names out of a hat of who potentially might be people to team up with, you might look first at private sector members of the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society. So there's other information things here. How close are we to the end of that time? Cool. There's other information sources here. A lot of them come out of Camera Consulting. You have access to this presentation